Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at The Rise and Repression of Radical Labor by Daniel Fusfeld, Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company, 1980. The key idea of this text is that the radical movement in the United States from the 1870s to the 1920s represented a powerful demonstration of working people in America banding together and demanding great changes to the political and economic fabric of American society. These movements made terrific triumphs over great and often violent odds. The text also argues that the reason these movements are so unknown within the average American's historical understanding stems from the pro-big business and capitalistic facets among the elite in this country using mass repression to erase the history of radical labor from the American landscape. Let's take a look at the text in depth. Prologue, the issues. The text starts by explaining why the history of radical labor is so often missing from historical accounts, namely that high wages, democratic suffrage, class fluidity, etc. allegedly existed so much more so in early industrial American society than in Europe society, and so American labor didn't need to be radical. And also due to the alleged class fluidity, American workers developed job consciousness or wage consciousness rather than class consciousness. The idea here being that workers in America generally fought for better wages or moved to another part of the country rather than banding together to work for changing the economic system of capitalism as a whole. To this, Fusfeld replies, these explanations ignore the role of repression in eliminating labor radicalism as a viable alternative for American workers. Act 1. From Mass Strike to Haymarket, 1877 to 1887. The text takes us to the beginning, looking at the first inklings of labor revolt in America. Riots, strikes, taking over cities and establishing radical governments. The other side of these acts, of course, unfortunately, being the rise of repression, first with local militias, then state militias, now known as the National Guard, and states enacting conspiracy laws. As Fusfeld explains, the state militias, which had almost disappeared after a long period of decline, were revived in 1877 for use primarily as a strike-breaking force. Fusfeld defines the militia thusly. Established by Congress in 1792 as a compulsory national military reserve, the militias had become voluntary organizations and, where the units survived, chiefly social and honorific function. They proved almost useless when used in their own localities, apparently because of unwillingness to shoot their neighbors, and elsewhere they required support from the regular army. Militia summer camps were established. There were only 2 in 1877, but grew to 32 training camps by 1889. 1877 also saw the establishment of both a public and active Knights of Labor, as well as the creation of local police forces. Here, Fusfeld defines the Knights of Labor, stating, the Knights of Labor was not a radical organization in the modern sense. It did not advocate government ownership of productive resources or even big industry, and did not seek to change the system of private ownership. However, its basic thrust was toward workers as a class, and it advocated a more equalitarian distribution of income. The Knights sought to do this by economic redistribution, called about by a coalition of all workers in a single organization. Here, Fusfeld clarifies that radical labor in the U.S. is not an adoption of radical ideas imported from radical thinkers in Europe, such as Marx or the French Revolution. He states, it is a mistake to find the origins of American labor radicalism in European radical ideologies. Instead, radicalism in the American labor movement developed solely and painfully out of class conflict in the American economy itself. Skilled workers and old craft unions had had a monopoly on making demands, and so saw the Knights of Labor as a threat to their bargaining power, and so the American Federation of Labor was formed, and the split between skilled and unskilled labor intensified. The skilled labor, AFL, and job consciousness on one side, and the unskilled labor, KFL, class consciousness on the other side. The AFL and the KFL did join sides, however, when fighting for the 8-hour workday. This affected both skilled and unskilled workers, and also spread work to the unemployed, which cut down on competition for jobs, which led to raised wages. The text then, of course, lays out in detail the Haymarket Affair. Act 2. Labor and Business Strategies, 1887 to 1902. The chapter starts by explaining that newspapers and big businesses used the Haymarket Affair and trial to demonize labor unions and radical groups, and so all over the country, meetings were broken up by vigilantes, print shops and other equipment were destroyed, and of course racism was widely used, and local police either looked the other way or actively assisted in the destruction. Fusfeld continues. The Knights of Labor, which by now was identified in the public mind with mass action by workers, was destroyed in the reaction to Haymarket. Although poor leadership and a series of unsuccessful strikes in 1886 and 1887 contributed to the organization's decline, its members fell from over 750,000 in 1886 to probably less than 800,000 in 1890. Fusfeld then explains that the post-Civil War big business dynasties, such as Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, etc., led to various industrial unions, such as the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the Western Federation of Miners, the American Railway Union, and the United Mine Workers, all of whom are given brief histories. This is where the bulk of the stories around labor conflict, various strikes, and repression, etc. are given. As Fusfeld explains, the instruments used to fight class organizations of working people were brought to a higher degree of effectiveness. Mass media to arouse public opinion, the courts to provide a legal basis for the use of force, strikebreakers to keep operations going and for use as private armies, and jail for the leaders of the workers. All of this was done under the protective umbrella of an appeal to law and order, the sanctity of private property, and the United States Constitution and Americanism. Fusfeld concluded the chapter stating, the Union movement was dominated by conservative leaders like Gompers and Michael, who opposed radical change and political action and favored immediate economic gains within the existing economic order. Essentially, the split between radical labor trying to radically change the form and function of the government and economy of the U.S., and the business unionism which wanted to work within the government and big business to gain benefits for the workers. Act 3, Anthracite, 1902. Anthracite, for which this chapter was named, is an important coal miners' strike with the standard demands of an 8-hour workday, a raise in wages, and a recognition of their union and its bargaining power. What made this strike significant is that there was a debate upon whether other coal miners should join the strike with the potential of alienating big business interests and upper-class communities who would want coal for the winter, or simply supplying the strike with funds and aid. In the end, the federal government took over the mine temporarily to get the coal to the public, while the mining company gave in to some of the demands and yet ultimately did not recognize the union. Fusfeld concludes, the real meaning of the anthracite coal strike of 1902 lay in the use of state power to support the coalition of conservative unions and corporate liberalism around the idea of collective bargaining and peaceful settlement of labor management differences. Essentially, the split between radical labor and business-conscious labor resulted in the federal government siding with business-friendly unionism. Act 4, the crushing of radical labor. Fusfeld begins the chapter stating that during the relatively strong surge of prosperity from 1897 to 1903, membership in labor unions, chiefly the craft unions and the AFL and the railroad brotherhoods, increased from about 500,000 to almost 2 million. In response, employers began organizing employers' associations which opposed trade unions, called for the right to hire, etc. Fusfeld explains the crushing of radical labor thusly. The pattern of action was as follows, with some variations due to local conditions. An industrial dispute develops between a mining company and the WFM, the Western Federation of Miners. Employer intransigence triggers a strike. Local authorities ask for state assistance in maintaining order, even though there may have been little or no disorder. The governor declares martial law and sends in the National Guard, made up of volunteers recruited for that particular mission and usually paid for by the affected mining companies. The Guard and local police protect strikebreakers brought in by the employers, and the mine starts operating again. The union leaders are arrested and either tried and jailed or deported from the area with a warning not to return. Because of these practices, the WFM leaders, other workers' leaders, etc., formed the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, to form one big union of all workers. Fusfeld states, by 1908, the IWW had become what its founders had intended, an instrument for organizing the working class as a whole and carrying on a class struggle against capitalism. Fusfeld defines the IWW as follows. The IWW was a highly democratic organization, attempting to reach out equally to all workers everywhere, with a one-person, one-vote approach to decision-making by the membership as a whole, which was difficult to put into practice and sometimes quite cumbersome. Its organizational structure reflected its ideas and philosophy of democratic class action. However, its program had a similar emphasis. The IWW envisioned a syndicalist organization of the economy, including direct worker control and management of individual enterprises, coordinated and planned at higher administrative levels by workers' representatives. The chief basis of the IWW's attraction for workers, however, was its militant action program of class opposition to employers. Fusfeld then gives several cases of the IWW fighting and winning against free speech bans, organizing immigrant workers, etc. Most of these cases, the IWW was successful because they raised the cost of business as usual. What I mean by this is that police and business complied to IWW demands out of the fear that the IWW activities would cost more money than it was worth to comply, and also that the IWW activities might radicalize more and more local populations. Fusfeld states, IWW leaders, most of whom preached nonviolent mass action, were tried for the violence for which employers and state police were largely responsible. Among the more highly publicized incidents were the trial of Joe Hill in Salt Lake City in 1914, the Bloody Sunday Massacre in Everett, Washington in 1916, and the vigilante lynching of Frank Little in Butte, Montana in 1917. Fusfeld then names several of the pro-labor federal laws that were put on the books during this time. The Ernman Act, the Caton Act, the Amson Act, and the creation of the U.S. Department of Labor. However, the pro-big business World War I and jingoism gave the government an excuse to categorically crush radical labor. Fusfeld states the Espionage Act of June 15, 1917, followed by the Sedition Act of May 16, 1918, provided the legal basis for federal action. Wartime patriotism provided a favorable climate of opinion. Basically, the Lynn Plan would use the tactics already developed at the state and local levels under the protection of federal legal sanctions to attack radical labor on a nationwide front. Fusfeld explains that the federal government was speaking out of both sides of its mouth. He states the U.S. Department of Labor was active in two ways. On the one hand, it deported numerous alien IWW members. On the other hand, it sought to replace the IWW with the AFL unions in the lumber and mining districts where the IWW had been strong. Fusfeld continues, it was the policy of the Wilson administration to encourage unionization and collective bargaining by job-conscious unions while it destroyed class-conscious unions. The Socialist Party was the next logical target for suppression of radicalism, particularly after the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia in 1917, aroused an increased fear of communism. This was done, as done before, by shutting down meetings, arresting leaders, denying mailing privileges, etc. Prologue. To conclude this text, Fusfeld explains that workers in the industrial America of the period between the Civil War and the First World War worked out several alternative paths towards solutions to their problems. Two were allowed to develop: job-conscious business unionism and the AFL type, and political action within the framework of existing political institutions. Both of these approaches accepted the existing economic order and offered no serious challenge to patterns of income distribution, the ownership of wealth, or the locus of economic and political power. A fair share within the existing structure was their theme. Two other adaptations were not allowed to exist: a labor movement emphasizing mass action, class consciousness, and a radical ideology and radical political action directed towards socialism. Here we have examined in detail only the repression of radical labor. Yet radicalism in the labor movement was as American as baseball, hot dogs, and pumpkin pie. In conclusion, this text really does explore specifically the rise and repression of radical labor in U.S. history, in a way that other radical histories, maybe People's History of the United States, for example, don't quite do. Unfortunately, there's quite a few stories missing here. The company who took all the doors off the homes in their company town in the middle of winter as a way of attacking strikers. The story of a company that had train cars of inmates sent in as strikebreakers, only for the union to take the train cars and set the inmates free. The fact that many company towns would distribute company-specific currency as a way to control the economic transactions of their town. The famous Wobbly War in Washington State, the Ludlow Massacre, to name a few. This text, however, does give us many of the brick-and-mortar essential labor struggle stories. The Pullman strike, the Haymarket Affair, etc. This text is not necessarily about the many specific cases of labor repression in American history. It is more about the overarching story. This text clearly demonstrates how radical labor was essential to many of the benefits and niceties we receive today. This text also gives us the history of how capitalists and government action work together to crush the demands of radical labor. Ward Churchill, when referring to the movements of the 60s, has asked us to imagine how much better the world would be had things like COINTELPRO not occurred. I believe the same can be done here. The same can be said for the context of this text. We should bemoan the destruction of the radical labor movement. Yes, we should praise the achievements that they made, but we should really ask ourselves how much brighter the world would be, how much more democratic, how much more civil, how much more free from desperate poverty would we be if the radical labor movement of the United States was not systematically and brutally stamped out by capitalist and government repression. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.